July 22, 1944. Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. A storm rolled over the dense pine forest surrounding Hitler's headquarters. Thunder rumbled across the sky, mingling with the distant growl of artillery from the east. Inside the fortified compound, the air was thick, not with gunpowder but with fear. Officers moved like shadows through narrow corridors lined with damp concrete and the smell of oil lamps. Somewhere deep below, a man with shaking hands stared at a map that no longer matched reality. That man was Adolf Hitler. Around him stood the pillars of the German High Command, Guderian, Keitel, Jodl, Model, men who once believed they were serving a genius. But on that night, as lightning flashed through the narrow windows of the Wolf's Lair, they saw something else. A pale, trembling figure, clutching power he no longer understood. Outside, the narrator's voice echoes softly. The Red Army was advancing through Belarus. Inside, their leader was fighting ghosts. Hitler jabbed at the map, demanding a counterattack near Warsaw, a place where no German divisions remained. His orders had become fantasies drawn on paper. When reports contradicted his vision, he dismissed them as lies, calling them the work of cowards and defeatists. The generals exchanged silent glances. They knew entire corps had been destroyed, wiped out by Soviet offensives. But no one dared to speak the truth. The walls of the bunker trembled with another explosion in the distance. Still, the man at the center refused to hear reason. His voice broke the silence, sharp, bitter, and desperate. He shouted about phantom divisions, accusing his commanders of betrayal. Then came the moment that froze the room. If they don't exist, he barked, then create them. A chill spread through the command post. In that instant, every man present realized something unspoken. The line between command and delusion had been crossed. The war outside was collapsing, but the real battle, the one for reality, was being lost inside that bunker. The Wolf's Lair had once been a nerve center of precision. Now it felt like a tomb. Typewriters clicked aimlessly, telephones rang unanswered, and couriers whispered bad news that no one dared to deliver. Every conversation ended in the same sentence. Don't tell the Führer yet. They began filtering reports, hiding defeats, inflating victories, to preserve what little composure remained in their leaders' eyes. It was no longer strategy. It was survival. Hitler's health had begun to mirror his empire, shaking, unstable, fading. His hands trembled constantly, his voice cracked mid-speech, and he often mumbled about divine destiny. The doctors called it exhaustion. The generals called it something else, madness. Guderian kept a private journal that night. He wrote, he no longer commands. He imagines. Outside the bunker walls, the sound of rain mixed with distant artillery. Soldiers trudged through the mud, unaware that their leaders were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. As July deepened, the situation worsened. Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive, had destroyed Germany's Army Group Center. Hundreds of thousands of men were lost. Entire cities vanished behind enemy lines. But inside the Wolf's Lair, maps still showed neat blue lines marking German defenses that no longer existed. And so, the generals began to realize something even darker than defeat, that they were now participating in a lie. Each morning, Hitler demanded reports of imaginary divisions. Each evening, he drew arrows with a trembling hand, outlining counterattacks that would never happen. The generals stood silently as he spoke, nodding to a man who no longer lived in their world. The paranoia grew. He spoke of traitors everywhere, in Berlin, in the army, even in the ranks of his most loyal men. Every silence felt dangerous. Every whisper carried risk. Officers stopped making eye contact. No one trusted anyone anymore. In one meeting, as the map table creaked beneath Hitler's clenched fists, Field Marshal Keitel noticed something strange. The way his eyes darted across the room, as if seeing people who weren't there. He muttered under his breath about betrayal, about destiny, about a final victory ordained by fate. The generals said nothing. But the silence in that room was louder than any explosion. They were witnessing the decay of command. The world outside the Wolf's Lair was burning. Cities lay in ruins, refugees flooded the roads, and German troops were retreating on every front. But inside, Hitler insisted that everything was under control. He demanded new offensives, new weapons, new miracles. He spoke of secret divisions being trained underground, of superweapons that would soon destroy the Allies. Some officers nodded. Others bit their tongues until they tasted blood. What could they do? To question him meant treason. To obey him meant suicide. And so they obeyed outwardly. Inwardly, they began preparing for something else. The first whispers of resistance began not in Berlin, but in the Wolf's Lair itself. Quiet talks in hallways, coded notes passed between meetings. Men who once swore allegiance to Hitler now wondered if removing him was the only way to save Germany. But they underestimated the man's paranoia. He sensed their fear like an animal senses blood. He began keeping lists, names of officers he suspected of disloyalty. And then came the event that would change everything, an explosion that tore through the very heart of his empire. It was July 20th, 1944. The moment when suspicion turned to rage. The moment when every man who had doubted him would face the consequences. But that, the narrator's voice lowers, was only the beginning of the madness to come. The sound fades, the thunder, the whispers, the scratching of pens on paper. Only silence remains. A single candle burns on the map table, wax dripping onto a red line that once marked the Eastern Front. It flickers, then dies. And with that light goes the last trace of reason. July 20th, 1944. Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. The morning began like any other, tense, gray, and heavy with unspoken dread. Generals shuffled papers, couriers whispered updates, and aides avoided eye contact with the man whose moods decided their fate. But by midday, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the conference barracks, a single briefcase was placed beneath the map table. Minutes later, the world exploded. The blast shattered windows, scorched walls, and hurled men across the room. Smoke rolled through the corridors like a storm cloud, thick with dust and disbelief. Soldiers screamed, officers crawled through debris, and for a moment, no one knew who was alive. Then, out of the chaos, came a sound, a voice, hoarse but unmistakable. It was Hitler. Bruised, burned, but alive. That single fact changed everything. The failed assassination ignited a firestorm of paranoia that consumed what remained of Hitler's sanity. Within hours, he declared the plot the work of traitors within his own command. Not foreign agents, not spies, but his own officers. By nightfall, dozens were arrested. By dawn, the executions began. The once unshakable confidence of Germany's military elite shattered into fear. Men who had spent their lives in uniform now trembled at the sound of approaching boots. No one knew who could be trusted, not even the men who had nothing to do with the plot. Suspicion replaced loyalty, and whispers replaced strategy. Inside the Wolf's Lair, the atmosphere turned from tension to terror. The very walls seemed to listen. Hitler's rage echoed through the corridors, a mix of hatred and hysteria. He spoke for hours at a time, pacing, shaking, cursing invisible enemies. His generals sat in silence, their faces pale under the flickering lights. He ordered purges, mass arrests of officers, secret police raids across the Reich, and public hangings filmed for propaganda. He wanted fear to speak louder than reason. And it did. Generals like Guderian and Keitel, once symbols of military strength, now sat quietly, too afraid to question anything. When Hitler demanded reports of victory, they gave him fiction. When he ordered new offensives, they nodded and obeyed, even when they knew there were no troops left to fight them. Germany was collapsing, but its leader was already living in a different world, one built from paranoia and illusion. By August, the change was unmistakable. Hitler no longer trusted his generals. He stopped listening to staff briefings and began holding meetings at strange hours of the night. He'd summon men without warning, interrogate them about loyalty, and accuse them of secret plots. Once dismissed, they often vanished by morning. The Wolf's Lair was no longer a command center. It had become a prison of fear. Then one night came the moment that every man in that bunker would remember for the rest of his life. It was a few weeks after the July plot. Midnight. A sudden call summoned the high command to the main war room. The men arrived in silence, their boots echoing off concrete floors slick with humidity. They expected another tirade about treachery. Instead, what they found was something far more disturbing. Hitler stood beside a large map spread across the table. But this map was not printed. It was hand-drawn, uneven, and colored in wax crayons. Red arrows, blue lines, and yellow circles filled every inch, chaotic and childish. He began to speak softly at first, explaining his new plan. He talked about secret divisions hidden underground, legions of men trained in secret bases, preparing for a final counterattack that would turn the tide of the war. He described miracle weapons that would rain fire on the Allies, sweeping the skies clean of enemy planes. As he spoke, his eyes widened with feverish intensity. He pointed at the crayon lines as if they were real, tracing them across regions already lost to the Soviets. He spoke of hidden factories buried in mountains, of submarines that could cross oceans unseen, of jet fighters that could strike London and vanish before radar could blink. But those listening knew the truth. The factories had been bombed. The submarines were trapped in port. The airfields were rubble. Still, no one said a word. They watched as their leader, once the architect of conquest, stood before them as a man unmoored from reality. His voice cracked, his hands shook, and yet, in his own mind, victory was still certain. One general, Jodl, wrote in his private notes that night, "We are defending a dream, not a nation." And then came the second twist, the one that sealed their fate. When the meeting ended, several generals gathered quietly in a side room. They didn't speak openly of revolt, not after July 20th. But they spoke of survival, of deception. They realized that Hitler could no longer handle the truth, so they would stop giving it to him. From that night onward, the Wehrmacht became an illusion machine. They began creating false victory reports to keep Hitler calm, claiming enemy retreats that never happened, reinforcing divisions that did not exist. They even fabricated radio intercepts to match the lies. The generals who once commanded the most powerful army on earth had become actors in a tragedy, performing for an audience of one. And that one man believed every word. For weeks, Hitler's mood improved. He boasted that the Allies were exhausted, that the Soviets were faltering, that his miracle weapons would soon deliver vengeance. In reality, the front was collapsing faster than ever. But the generals continued their theater, afraid that the truth would unleash another storm of executions. The Wolf's Lair became a stage, one where lies were strategy and silence was loyalty. Each passing day deepened the illusion. Hitler stopped reading actual intelligence reports, relying instead on hand-picked summaries written to flatter him. Maps in the war room no longer reflected the real front lines. When the Allies advanced, he ordered the map to be redrawn to show otherwise. Reality itself was being rewritten, and no one dared to correct it. Outside the bunker, Germany was breaking apart. The Allies had crossed into France. The Soviets were approaching East Prussia. And yet, inside, Hitler ordered another counteroffensive led by divisions that existed only on paper. The few generals who still tried to reason with him, like Guderian, were met with fury. He screamed, pounded the table, and accused them of defeatism. "Faith," he shouted, "will win the war, not numbers." The men left the room in silence, their faces hollow. They no longer feared defeat. They feared the mind of the man commanding it. Each night, as bombers passed overhead, the officers heard the sounds of destruction growing closer. Yet, even then, Hitler refused to allow evacuation. He claimed destiny would protect him. Some began to believe he wanted the country to burn with him. By late autumn of 1944, the illusion was complete. The generals' deception had succeeded too well. Their false victories and fake reports had built a wall of fantasy that even they began to hide behind. They were lying to their leader, lying to their men, and lying to themselves. Germany's war machine had become a ghost army, fueled not by steel or fuel, but by denial. And in the heart of it all, Adolf Hitler, the man who once commanded the world's fear, now stood surrounded by men who pitted him. He believed himself destined for triumph, while those around him prayed for an end, any end. In one of his final briefings at the Wolf's Lair, he looked up from a map and said softly, "The world will remember my victory." No one answered, because every man in that room already knew the truth. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting to survive their leader. The narrator's voice fades to a low, solemn tone. The Wolf's Lair was silent again. Outside, snow began to fall over East Prussia, covering the graves, the wreckage, and the truth. But beneath that snow, something dark was still spreading. Madness had taken root, and soon it would reach Berlin. The sound of wind rises, the whisper of winter over ruins. The light in the bunker dims to black. January 1945. Berlin. The capital of the Reich was a skeleton of what it once was. Smoke rose endlessly from streets where entire blocks had vanished. Bridges lay shattered, railway lines twisted like broken ribs. The air carried a constant hum, the deep, distant thunder of Soviet artillery. Berlin was dying, and everyone knew it. Everyone except the man buried deep beneath it. In the cold concrete corridors of the Führer bunker, the walls sweated from condensation and the air stank of oil, damp uniforms, and desperation. Maps still lined the tables, their colors faded, their markings meaningless. The generals entered in silence, their footsteps echoing like funeral drums. Hitler was waiting. His hair had turned gray, his posture bent, his hand trembled uncontrollably as he clutched a pencil. Yet, in his eyes, the same fever burned, wild, defiant, and utterly detached from reality. He pointed at a sector on the map where the Soviets had already broken through. "Here," he said softly. "This is where we will strike back. Steiner's division will counterattack and crush them." But General Steiner's division didn't exist. Outside the bunker, what remained of Berlin's defenders were boys, the Hitler youth, and old men pressed into service with rifles from another war. But inside the bunker, the illusion continued. Hitler spoke of victory as if it were a breath away. He demanded offensives that could never happen, commanded armies that had long been destroyed, and punished anyone who dared tell him otherwise. The generals no longer argued. They had learned that truth was dangerous. So they stood there, nodding, pretending to believe. In private, they whispered about surrender, about negotiation, about ending the nightmare. But no one dared say it in front of him. He had become the embodiment of the Reich's delusion, a man standing in ruins, still talking about empire. Every night, the bunker shook as bombs fell above. Light fixtures swayed, dust rained from the ceiling, and the stale air filled with the groan of collapsing earth. Still, Hitler held his briefings. He spoke of reinforcements that were never coming. He spoke of secret weapons that no longer existed. He promised a miracle, a final victory, that only he could see. But outside, Berlin burned. The Red Army was closing in from the east, block by block. German civilians huddled in basements, listening to artillery and praying for silence. Food was gone, water was scarce, and the sound of distant screaming filled the nights. Inside the bunker, the world had shrunk to one room, one man, and one fantasy. Some of his generals, exhausted and broken, began taking their own lives. Others tried to escape the city, but few made it. The rest remained, not out of loyalty, but out of fear, trapped underground with the man who refused to surrender. Days passed without sunlight. Time lost meaning. In that claustrophobic darkness, Hitler became more erratic, more paranoid. He accused his commanders of betrayal, claiming they had disobeyed his orders. When reports arrived that Steiner's division had failed to attack, because there was no division to attack with, he flew into a rage so violent that even his guards stepped back. He shouted until his voice broke, cursing his generals, his allies, even his people. He blamed everyone but himself. And then, when the fury was spent, he sat down and began to cry. That moment, more than any explosion or battle, was the true collapse. The mighty Reich, once built on fear and fanaticism, had dissolved into a single man weeping in a bunker. Outside, artillery thundered closer. The Soviets were now less than a mile away. Inside, the last loyal officers watched their leader unravel. He spoke to portraits. He gave orders to imaginary armies. He even dictated victory bulletins to his secretary to be broadcast to a nation that no longer existed. And then, the silence began. It started as hesitation, fewer reports, fewer meetings, fewer words. The generals had stopped trying. The illusion could no longer be maintained. The truth had become too heavy to hide. They knew the war was lost. They knew their leader was lost. And yet they remained. For days, they lived in that stillness, the quiet before the inevitable. The only sounds were the scratching of pencils, the distant thud of explosions, and the faint dripping of water from the sea. Eiling. In that silence, the weight of everything settled, the lies, the fear, the guilt. And then, on one gray morning in late April, it ended. Hitler withdrew into his private quarters. He spoke briefly to his staff, thanked a few for their service, and disappeared behind a door. The generals waited in the hallway, saying nothing. Minutes passed. Then a single gunshot. The sound was soft, almost merciful. The guards looked at one another, but said nothing. Some wept. Others simply stood there, numb. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the same silence that had haunted the Wolf's Lair the night they first realized their leader was insane. The silence of men who no longer knew what to believe. Above them, Berlin was burning. The Reich was finished. And yet deep underground, it ended not with a speech or a command, but with that same quiet void. In the following days, the Soviets entered the city. The bunker was discovered. The maps, the orders, the crayon drawings, all still there, scattered across the tables like relics of madness. The world saw what had become of the man who once claimed destiny itself. The narrator's tone softens. The moment Germany's generals knew their leader was insane was not marked by violence, or shouting, or collapse. It was marked by silence. A silence that swallowed the last breath of an empire and the last illusion of power. The sound fades, replaced by the faint echo of marching boots, distant, fading into memory. For a moment, there is only stillness. Then, the voice returns, slow, reflective, human. History remembers the battles, the weapons, the victories. But it rarely remembers the silence. The moment when men who once held the world in their hands realized they were following madness. That was the true end of the Third Reich. Not with a roar, but with the quiet surrender of reason. The camera would slowly fade through images of ruins, destroyed streets, and the cold emptiness of the bunker, before the narrator delivers the final lines. Your signature outro. If stories like this remind you that truth is often the first casualty of war, then take a moment to share this video, hit the like button, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. We tell the stories history tried to bury, the real moments of courage, tragedy, and human madness that shaped our world. And before you go, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your country or city in the comments. I read every one, and I love seeing how our community of history lovers spans the world, from London to Manila, from Texas to Cape Town. Stay curious, stay respectful, and as always, stay legendary. Fade out over slow strings, ending on the quiet image of a candle flickering out in the BU. Concur.